when it pertains to economics, I find my views aligning a lot with the laissez-faire with safety nets, Austrian, libertarian, Adam Smith economic model. People like the late Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Art Laffer, and others are economists that I agree with when it pertains to low taxes, low regulations, so on and so forth. However, one area that I find myself disagreeing with them on in this school of thinking is that free trade, quote unquote free trade with quotes, because it's not really free trade, is good for everybody. It's good because for every one job you lose, you gain two or more. That's what we kept hearing whenever Bill Clinton was trying to push through NAFTA. Well, if we start buying stuff in China, we know that it's going to create two jobs for every one job lost. That's what economics says. You had Al Gore and Ross Perot going back and forth. And Ross Perot was right about this. He said, and when NAFTA is signed, you're going to hear a giant sucking sound because all these jobs are going to be sucked out of the United States and then brought into China. Now, if that is true, then look at Detroit, Michigan. There's an interesting documentary on PBS that talks about how China's manufacturing rise in the late 90s has also culminated into the decline of Detroit. There are factories that are totally vacant, neighborhoods where nobody lives. The poverty rate is outstanding there. And I mean outstandingly high. Nothing's outstanding about being in poverty. The point is, though, that area used to be booming when you produce cars in the United States. If that were the case, then shouldn't Michigan, specifically Detroit, have more jobs? Because according to these economists, for every one job you lose, you net at least two or more. So you're telling me Ford Motor Company in Detroit decides to move to China or Mexico. John is an assembly line worker who inspects the tires. Let's say he's at the end of the assembly line and he inspects the tires to make sure everything's good before they package it. Well, when that job goes overseas, what happens to John? Where does he work now? He has to find another place for employment, right? It's not like magically you have two other jobs being created. That doesn't make any logical sense. I would challenge some of these economists to at least go on YouTube and look up Detroit. And you can see the decadence, you can see the total picture, an effigy of what happens when you rely too much on free trade. Now, does free trade have some good components? Of course it does. For instance, an iPhone, if you were to make all the components in the United States, it would increase the production of the phone from $190 to $600, which could also increase the price to $2,000, and that's just on production alone. Not to mention, if people are working here in the US, you would have to pay them more per hour. So the cost of labor and the cost of production would also equate into a more expensive iPhone, which would be nearly damn impossible for anyone to afford. And this is according to MarketWatch.org. This isn't me pulling facts out of my ass here. The reason that Europe was so successful during the Roman Empire is Rome had a stable currency, they had a stable military, but one of the biggest things they had was trade across many areas. You could go from Egypt to Syria, to France. At that time it was called Gaul. And you could trade tons of goods using the same currency. There were no barriers, there were no tariffs, there were no extra added cost. After Rome, at least part of Rome, fell, Europe went into the Dark Ages because you didn't have a stable currency and a stable way to trade things. That is the validity of it. However, the problem is when you rely on another country for all of your commodities, it can also cause a lot of problems. The United States imported last year in 2021 $541.53 billion from China. Now, according to these economists, we're supposed to have at least more jobs here, right? Because free trade. But the deficit was $355.3 billion. That means that we bought $355.3 billion more from China than they bought from us. Where are all these jobs that are supposed to be created, Mr. Economist? I don't see it. Some other numbers that I find interesting. Manufacturing is only 11.39% of the U.S. economy. It only employs 8.5% of the workforce. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the majority of our economy is now a service economy, 79%. You're telling me when these manufacturing jobs leave that we're supposed to have more being created. I don't see it. I just don't. China, on the other hand, last year had manufacturing equate for 39.4% of their GDP. China is now the number one manufacturing economy. The United States is not even in the top 10. We are the number one consumer economy. We consume more than we build. And now we're seeing shortages due to us relying too much on China. Essentially, when you rely on China, China is a totalitarian regime. They're in lockdown right now. You have friction with Xi Jinping and the Communist Party right now. We don't really know what's going on 100% because it's a closed society. The point is, now there are shortages in many places. Last Saturday, I was supposed to work a little overtime. However, some of the components that we use were not being delivered. We ran out of products. Essentially, we put the products together in one area, and then in another area, we run them, package them, and then somebody else manufactures them. But the point is, we didn't even have the parts so we could build the product. Therefore, we ran out of product. Because we're relying on China for all of our manufacturing goods. I'm not blaming the company. You have to go and compete in the free market. You can't lose money from buying stuff in the US. However, it affects everybody. Many workers, many companies are now feeling the effects of us bowing down to China for so long. Ever since Nixon had his ping pong game that he played with Mao Zedong, what was it? They called it something diplomacy. I don't know. It's been a long time. Ping pong diplomacy is what it was called. And Nixon opened China. And ever since then, we've been running massive deficits with China. This is the result. You have massive deficits, massive shortages, and entire towns. It's not just Detroit. Detroit is symbolic. It's emblematic. But if you really want to see all of this, look at towns in Ohio. Look at towns in Colorado. Look at the Rust Belt states. There's entire warehouses, entire factories that are just rotting away. In my town, there was a furniture factory called Berkline. That building has been rotting away for over 10 years now due to the manufacturing. I remember my dad used to work for the toy company Mattel in Kentucky. They ended up moving their operations to Mexico. My dad didn't magically have two other jobs that were offered to him. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but what is the evidence to suggest that free trade creates more jobs than it makes us lose? Like I said, the United States is no longer a manufacturing economy. China imports 355.3 billion more to us than we do to them. My question is, where are all those jobs?